On a night in March of 2017, a huge bonfire lit up the yard at a house party in Youngstown, Ohio. A group of friends in their 20 seconds and 30 seconds and 30 seconds sat around the fire drinking beer, talking, and having a great time. And as the night went on, and these friends kept on partying, none of them could have imagined that this bonfire would soon help police solve one of the most horrific crimes the city of Youngstown had ever witnessed. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast. Because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please invite the follow button to a costume party, but don't tell them it's actually awake. Okay, let's get into today's story. On February 24th, 2017, 28-year-old Shannon Graves sat on the couch watching TV with her boyfriend in her apartment in Youngstown, Ohio. Shannon changed the channel, and right away she could see that her boyfriend, who was a man in his early 30 seconds named Arturo Navoa, looked annoyed by what she wanted to watch. So she flipped the channel to something else. Then Shannon glanced over at Arturo, but he still looked annoyed. Shannon sighed, trying her best to keep her cool. It was not that long ago that sitting on the couch with Arturo would have made for a relaxing evening at home. But now, every time the two were around each other, they just seemed to argue about everything. Even meaningless stuff, like what to watch on TV. Shannon put the remote down and then leaned back on the couch and didn't say anything. She hoped that maybe if she just sat there in silence, they could avoid a fight. But in reality, Shannon knew that this TV show she chose, or whatever little thing they ended up arguing about next, was actually just a symptom of a much bigger problem. Her and Arturo's relationship was clearly falling apart. The two of them met almost a year earlier at the club, where Shannon had been working nights as a dancer while she went to classes during the day to earn her cosmetology degree. And despite their obvious differences, at first they had gotten along great. Shannon was outgoing and always seemed to be on the move, while Arturo was quiet and more reserved. But they thought their differences actually complemented each other really well. So, after dating for only a few months, Shannon and Arturo moved into an apartment together, and that's when things started to go bad. It was like right away. They just both stopped trusting each other. Arturo accused Shannon of still being into her ex-boyfriend, a guy she'd actually been living with before she met Arturo, and Shannon was convinced that Arturo had a thing for this woman who was always hanging around him when he would come to see Shannon at the club. But whether or not those things were true, Shannon knew her issues with the relationship were deeper than just thinking Arturo might like some other girl. Shannon had always been someone who loved change. She just never wanted to feel stuck. And so, to avoid that feeling, she would often do things like dye her long black hair green and blue, or she'd take much bigger steps, like she would occasionally just leave town for weeks at a time to go on an adventure by herself, without telling anyone where she was at. But living with Arturo had definitely made Shannon feel stuck, and over the last few months, that feeling had really worn her down. Back in the apartment, Shannon eventually just stood up from the couch and began to walk out of the room. But as she did, Arturo snapped at her for some reason, and then before long, the two of them were just yelling at each other. And the argument escalated, even though neither of them really knew what they were even fighting about, until finally Arturo said, "You know, maybe I should just leave for good." And then he stormed out. Shannon stood there in her apartment for a minute, trying to catch her breath and calm down. She was mad, but she also couldn't help but feel this sense of relief. If Arturo was gone, like really gone, she could now do anything she wanted. She could make a change, she could go someplace new. A few months earlier, Shannon had finally earned her cosmetology degree. She had worked really hard for it, and she was proud of herself. Some people had been surprised because they thought getting a degree sort of went against Shannon's need for constant change. But Shannon saw things differently. Her degree could open doors and give her a chance to work as a cosmetologist in different cities. Or maybe she could even become a highly sought-after makeup artist who would get to travel all over the world. But Arturo had never really supported her dreams, so she had kind of given up on them. Now, she could start putting her degree and her talents to work and she would not have to do that in Youngstown, Ohio. And just thinking about the possibilities for the future got her really excited. Shannon walked to the bathroom, gotten dressed, and turned on the shower. In her mind, she would wash off all the bad stuff that had happened recently, and it would be like the first small step towards a fresh start. On June 22nd, 2017, so for months after Shannon and Arturo had their big fight, Detective Mike Lambert of the Youngstown Police Department looked up from his desk and he saw a uniformed police officer standing there with a woman who looked very pale and worried. Detective Lambert asked how he could help. The woman said her name was Debbie DePaul, and she needed to file a missing persons report. She said that nobody had seen or talked to her younger half-sister, Shannon Graves, in 4 months. A confused look came across Lambert's face, and for a second he thought he must have misheard her. And so he asked her again, how long has it been since anybody talked to your half-sister? And Debbie repeated herself and said again, it had been for months. This blew Lambert away. In all his time as a detective, he'd seen family and friends typically file missing persons reports if anything too soon, like before they really needed to, not for months after the fact. In fact, in the majority of cases he'd worked, the supposed missing person had turned up before the cops could even launch a real search. So he really couldn't understand why Debbie, or anyone else close to Shannon, had waited this long to talk to the police. Lambert told the other officer he could leave, and he asked Debbie to take a seat and walk him through what was going on here. After the officer left, Debbie sat down and said she knew how strange it must sound that she had waited this long, but if Lambert knew her sister Shannon, it would make way more sense. She said that Shannon had a history of just sort of taking off and not talking to anyone for long periods of time. It was something she'd done since she was a teenager, and as difficult as it was to deal with that, Shannon's friends and family had sort of come to accept it about her. It was one of the things that made Shannon who she was. But now they noticed that Shannon had not called on a couple of family birthdays, and she also hadn't checked in when her best friend had a baby. And that was not like Shannon at all. Even when she went away without telling anyone, she would always call on these important days. Detective Lambert didn't say this, but he knew for months might as well have been an eternity when it came to a missing persons case. If Shannon had really left town like her sister claimed she liked to do, well, Shannon could be anywhere in the world by now. But Lambert figured he would just start his investigation the same way he would if Shannon had only been missing for a few days. So he took down information about Shannon's physical appearance, her last known address, and the places she had worked. He also learned small details. Like Shannon's favorite color was pink and she loved wearing friendship bracelets. And so, after only speaking to Debbie for a few minutes, Detective Lambert had a pretty good picture of who Shannon was. But he had one more question. He asked Debbie if Shannon had a romantic partner. Debbie said yes, Shannon had a boyfriend, or at least she did the last time they had spoken. She had been living with a guy named Arturo Novoa, and Shannon had told Debbie that she and Arturo fought all the time. The following day, Detective Lambert sat down with Arturo in a small interview room at the station. Lambert had looked into Arturo the night before. He knew Arturo had a couple of minor run-ins with the police, but nothing big, and he had no record of violent crimes or anything like that. So Lambert really just hoped that Arturo knew where Shannon was, or at least had heard from her over the past 4 months. And also, if he hadn't, he hoped to get a good idea of what Arturo and Shannon's relationship had been like. But when Lambert asked Arturo when he'd last seen or talked to Shannon, Arturo seemed surprised by the question. He said he'd already told all this to Shannon's family when they called him like a month or so earlier. He said he and Shannon had broken up back in February. He admitted that things ended pretty badly, so they had not spoken to each other since. The last he'd heard, Shannon was living with some guy in Cleveland, which was over an hour away from Youngstown. Arturo didn't know the name of the man that Shannon was supposedly living with, so he really couldn't provide much more color than he already had. And so Lambert wrapped up their conversation soon after that, and then he reached out to Shannon's sister, Debbie, to see if she knew of any men other than Arturo that Shannon could possibly be with. Debbie said before Shannon had started dating Arturo, she'd been in a serious relationship with a man named John Scaraday. Just hearing that name shocked Lambert, and it caused him to immediately begin planning his next move, because he knew John Scar all too well. John had a substantial criminal history. In fact, he had done time in prison on drug charges, and Lambert knew that John had gotten out of prison right around the last time anyone had seen Shannon. After speaking to Debbie, Detective Lambert got to work right away tracking down John. And it would turn out he was not in Cleveland. He was in Youngstown trying to get his life together after getting out of prison. The following day, when John Scar walked into the interview room at the station, he greeted Detective Lambert like they were old friends. And when the detective brought up Shannon, John didn't seem surprised at all. He said he'd learned that Shannon had disappeared not long after he'd gotten out of prison. So Lambert asked if he was worried about her, and John, in response to this, did something that Lambert did not see coming at all. John leaned forward in his chair and said yes, he was really worried. In fact, he was so worried he'd started his own investigation. Lambert was so caught off guard by this that he didn't really know how to react. What did John mean he was doing his own investigation? But just then, John grabbed his phone out of his pocket, pulled up his photos, and showed them to Lambert. And Lambert saw multiple pictures of different cars that had been parked right outside of Shannon's apartment. Over the past few months, John had staked out the place looking for Shannon, or for anything or anyone that seemed out of the ordinary. Lambert felt a little conflicted. He believed if something bad had happened to Shannon, John had to be a major suspect here. But he couldn't deny that he did want to track down all of these cars John had photographed at Shannon's apartment. So ultimately, Lambert did get the license plate numbers of all the cars, and he told John to stop staking out Shannon's place and to just let the police do their jobs. John said he totally understood. He just wanted to find Shannon and make sure she was okay. Detective Lambert knew John had connections to the criminal world of Youngstown, Ohio. So there really was a chance that John thought he was the best person to find Shannon, a woman he claimed to still be in love with. But there was also a chance that John was just trying to send the police on some kind of wild goose chase to keep them off of his trail, because maybe he had something to do with what happened to Shannon. So in the days following their meeting, Lambert and his team tried to get a clear picture of everywhere John had been since he'd gotten out of prison, and if he'd had any communication with Shannon near the time she'd supposedly disappeared. Police also questioned Shannon's friends, her family, and her co-workers at the nightclub, and they also followed up on all those cars John had photographed. But for Shannon's half-sister Debbie, the police were not moving fast enough. She now believed that she and her family had waited way too long to get the cops involved, and so she felt like she had to do something to make up for that. So, in late June, about a week after she had filed the missing persons report, Debbie knocked on the door of a house in Youngstown that looked pretty much like all the other houses around it, except for the sign in the window that advertised psychic readings. A woman with a soft smile opened the door and led Debbie down a hallway to a small, dark room. The woman told Debbie she was a psychic medium, which meant she claimed to be able to communicate with spirits, or the deceased and then was able to relay their messages to the living. Debbie sat down at a table with the medium and described Shannon and talked about how she'd been missing for months. The medium closed her eyes and listened carefully, and after a moment, she told Debbie she could see something, a bridge. Now, this medium didn't know exactly which bridge this was, but she was sure it was not far away from here, and somehow this bridge had to be connected to Shannon's disappearance. Debbie left the medium's house and immediately called a friend of hers and told her what the medium had said, and both women decided it was clear what they had to do next. They would have to search every bridge in Youngstown, Ohio. And so, for the next couple of weeks, Debbie and her friend went around town visiting every bridge they could find. And it started to feel like a waste of time. That is until one afternoon when Debbie and her friend approached a small bridge that neither of them had driven on before. As they stepped out of the car, they saw something laying on the ground near the base of one of the bridge's girders. When Debbie walked over to it and knelt down to get a better look, she almost started crying because there laying on the ground were saw blades, a rope, and a pink saw. Debbie and her friend took pictures of the objects and then drove straight to the police station. Debbie told Detective Lambert about the medium's vision and showed him the photos of what they'd found at the bridge. Lambert had learned it from Debbie when they first met that Shannon's favorite color was pink and that she loved wearing pink clothes. He couldn't just ignore saw blades and a rope being found out in the middle of nowhere next to a pink sock. So the detective told Debbie that he and his team would look into it right away. But as Lambert headed out to this bridge, he started to feel like this case was getting away from him. He was already dealing with the missing woman's ex-boyfriend conducting his own investigation, and now he was following up on a lead that apparently came from a psychic medium. And Lambert still had no idea what had happened to Shannon. She really could just be in Cleveland or anywhere else purposely avoiding her friends and family, or she could be the victim of a horrible crime. One way or the other, Lambert needed some piece of concrete evidence to point him in the right direction, and while he didn't want to rule anything out, he doubted that that piece of evidence was going to come from a psychic vision. About a month later, on the afternoon of July 29th, a woman was making Italian food at her house in a small town just a few miles from Youngstown. As she cooked, she looked down at the food she was making and suddenly she got mad at herself. She realized she didn't have enough meat to make the meatballs she was planning to serve with this meal. She thought about taking a quick trip to the grocery store, but then she remembered something. So she called out to her husband in the next room and told him to keep an eye on the stove. She left the kitchen and walked down a set of old wooden steps into the basement. She passed by their washer and dryer and walked over to a white rectangle-shaped chest freezer that was standing up against the wall. Now, this woman knew there was meat inside this freezer and she could use it to make her meatballs. But there was a problem. The freezer had a padlock on it. But the woman was undeterred. She grabbed a nearby screwdriver off a work table and used it to pry the entire metal latch that the lock was connected to off the freezer. And so, now with the freezer unlocked, the woman opened it up and immediately she began to scream. At about 5:30 that afternoon, 2 hours after that woman had looked inside the freezer, crime scene investigator Tony Marzullo walked down the stairs into the married couple's basement. Marzullo worked out of Youngstown, but he helped in the surrounding smaller towns when he was needed. And today, he'd gotten one of the strangest calls he'd ever received from police dispatch in one of those smaller towns. Marzullo put on his gloves and approached the freezer. The freezer door was still open and he could see inside of the freezer was an orange plastic bucket with trash bags sticking out of it. Marzullo got closer and leaned over the freezer and looked inside at that bucket, and the instant he did, he reflexively put his hand over his mouth and tried to collect himself. Even the call from dispatch had not prepared him for this, because in the bucket Marzullo was looking at the top half of a frozen, severed human head. Marzullo looked down deeper into the freezer and he saw the entire thing was basically filled with trash bags. And as he pulled out each of these bags and looked inside of them, he found human legs, human arms, and human hands. Marzullo had no idea who the victim was, but instinctively, he grabbed his phone and called Detective Lambert. Later that evening, Detective Lambert stood in the basement with Marzullo and a group of police officers and forensic technicians. Like Lambert had expected, the psychic vision and the objects found at that bridge had not given him any new leads in Shannon's case, and neither had any of the interviews Lambert had conducted to this point. Basically, the case had stalled. He had no idea where Shannon was or what happened to her. But now, as he stood over the freezer, he had a sinking feeling that the body he was looking at could be hers. Now, they would need to run some tests to officially identify the body, but Marzullo was very confident they could do that quickly. Forensic techs would allow the severed hands they'd found to defrost, then they would use a saline solution to rehydrate the fingers on those hands, which would allow them to pull clean fingerprints. While Lambert waited for those results, he interviewed the married couple who lived at the house to try to figure out how a dismembered body had wound up in their basement. The couple proved to be extremely cooperative. They said that freezer was not theirs. A friend had asked to store it in their house because the electricity in his house had been cut off and he didn't want the meat in the freezer to go bad. When their friend had brought it over, they did think it was odd that the freezer had a padlock on it, but they'd assumed the freezer door just didn't stay shut on its own, so their friend must have locked it just to make sure the meat inside stayed frozen. The woman went on to tell Lambert that the only reason she had broken into the freezer is because she really wanted to make meatballs. Lambert thought the story was definitely strange, but none of it sounded untrue. So he asked, who was this friend who gave them the freezer. They said his name was Anthony Gonzalez, but he was trying to become a hip-hop star, so sometimes he went by the name Tony G. That night, Lambert began his search for Anthony Gonzalez, aka Tony G. But despite it seeming like a pretty common name, he could not find a single Anthony Gonzalez living in Youngstown. And before Lambert could expand his search for Anthony to nearby towns, he got a call from Marzullo. Marzullo told him the lab had successfully pulled fingerprints from the now defrosted hands they'd found, and they were able to officially identify the victim. The body in the freezer was Shannon Graves. Now that police had finally found Shannon's body, this had become a homicide investigation. News of the grisly discovery in the basement spread across Youngstown. And in the days following the discovery, Detective Lambert got an unexpected visitor at the station. Shannon's ex-boyfriend John had returned. John heard about Shannon's body, and he admitted right off the bat to Detective Lambert that despite what he'd promised him, he said he had not actually given up his own investigation into Shannon's case. And in fact, now he had discovered something huge. John heard from a friend of his about a house party that had taken place a few months earlier, and at this house party, a man named Andrew Herman had been burning some of Shannon's stuff at a huge bonfire. With help from John, Detective Lambert and several other investigators found their way to the house where this party had taken place. And as soon as they got out of their cars, they could see the remnants of a bonfire in the front yard. There was a big pit filled with ashes and big pieces of wood around it that looked like they'd been used for seating. Lambert and the crime scene investigator walked across the dying grass in the front yard. They put on their gloves and began sifting through the large pile of ashes, and they found what looked like charred clothing and some burned pieces of plastic. But to their utter shock, it looked like one object had survived the fire and remained almost perfectly preserved. And as Lambert bent down and pulled this object out of the ashes, he almost couldn't believe it because of all the possible things he could have found. This was like the perfect clue. The object was a friendship bracelet with small plastic beads strung on it that spelled out Shannon. There was no doubt that John had been right. Somebody had been burning Shannon's things. Investigators headed back to the station with this new piece of evidence, and Lambert set up a meeting with Andrew Herman, the man John said had been burning Shannon's things. But John warned Lambert to watch out because Andrew was a total psychopath, a guy who was into black magic and who worshipped the serial killer Cannibal Jeffrey Dahmer. On August 7th, 2017, so about a week and a half after the discovery of Shannon's body, Detective Lambert led Andrew into an interview room, and Lambert had to admit that Andrew was not anything like what he'd expected. Andrew wore a well-fitted suit and tie, and his hair was short and neatly combed. He looked way more like a guy who worked at a bank than somebody who was into black magic and serial killers. But Lambert knew the way this guy was dressing didn't prove anything one way or another. Detective Lambert told Andrew right away that they had gone to the site of the house party and discovered a friendship bracelet inside of a fire pit that they were sure belonged to Shannon Graves, and that they'd heard Andrew was the one trying to burn it. Andrew nodded and said, "Yep, the bracelet was Shannon's and I was trying to burn it." And he also admitted that he and a couple other people had also burned some of Shannon's other things at that party. Lambert just looked at him and said it seemed very suspicious that they had burned the belongings of a woman who'd recently been found brutally murdered. But Andrew did not flinch. In a perfectly calm voice, he said they had burned the stuff as a favor for a friend, Anthony Gonzalez. Now, Detective Lambert did not react to what he was hearing, but inside, after hearing that name, he felt like he was about to lock up this investigation, because he was now able to connect Anthony aka Tony G, the man who brought the freezer to the married couple's basement, directly to the bonfire that had been used to get rid of Shannon's personal belongings. So Lambert asked why his friend Anthony had wanted to burn Shannon's stuff in the first place. Andrew sat there in silence for a minute, and then he began to speak. And when he did, without ever losing his cool, he told a story that was even gorier and more disturbing than any story Detective Lambert had ever heard in his life. And by the time Andrew stopped telling the story, Lambert knew exactly what had happened to Shannon Graves. Based on information from Andrew, evidence found in the basement freezer, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, The following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Shannon on February 24th, 2017 and the following days. The killer walked through Shannon's apartment, breathing heavily and clutching a hammer in their hand. They could hear the shower running, so they headed for the bathroom. Once there, they opened the door and stepped inside. Shannon shouted something and pulled back the shower curtain, but before she could even figure out what was happening, the killer raised the hammer and slammed it into the top of her head. Shannon's body collapsed in the shower and blood began to run into the drain. As for the killer, they continued to swing the hammer over and over again into Shannon's head. Her body twitched and then eventually stopped moving. She was dead in the shower. The killer turned off the water and just stood there for a second, staring down at what they'd done. And for the first time, they realized that killing Shannon was actually just the beginning. Now they had to get rid of her body. The killer rushed to the kitchen, found trash bags, and came right back. They opened up a bathroom cabinet, grabbed an electric razor, and turned it on. Then they leaned into the shower and shaved Shannon's head, believing this would help disguise her identity. When they were finished, the killer put the razor back, opened one of the trash bags, and awkwardly pulled Shannon's body out of the shower onto the bathroom floor. They tried to stuff Shannon into the trash bag, but quickly realized that was never going to work. So they tried to wrap the trash bag around her, but that failed too. The bag just wasn't big enough. The killer started to panic. They knew they had not thought this through, so they grabbed their phone and called their girlfriend. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. The killer opened it and quickly led their girlfriend into the bathroom and showed her Shannon's body. The girlfriend did her best to stay calm. She said after dark, they could move Shannon's body to her place and figure out what to do with it from there. So the killer and their girlfriend spent a couple of hours in Shannon's apartment just kind of waiting around with Shannon's dead body, only a few feet away. Not long after sunset, the killer and the girlfriend grabbed Shannon's clothes off the bathroom floor. They took her purse and then did their best to wrap Shannon's body up in trash bags. Then they carried her body and her belongings out into the darkness and put everything into the trunk of the girlfriend's car. They drove to the girlfriend's house and brought Shannon's body inside and laid it in the bathtub. Then the killer called the one friend they thought could help, and later that night, that friend arrived with a fully formed plan and a machete. The killer, the girlfriend, and the friend of the killer spent the entire night dismembering Shannon's body. At some point, the friend told the killer to order sulfuric acid online and to set up a delivery at a bulk store nearby. In the meantime, the friend gathered up all of Shannon's stuff the group had in their possession and went to a house party where they knew there was going to be a big bonfire. And they burned everything. Not long after that, the sulfuric acid arrived at the bulk store. The killer picked it up and the three of them covered the now dismembered body parts in the sulfuric acid, hoping to melt Shannon's skin down to the bone. But they soon discovered a problem. In an effort to save money, the killer had bought off-brand sulfuric acid and it just was not doing the trick. Large parts of Shannon's body were disintegrating in the acid, but not all of it was. So, the friend took the machete and started hacking away even more at Shannon's body, while the killer went out and bought a chest freezer. And eventually, the three of them were able to get Shannon's body parts into trash bags in the bucket, and they crammed all of that into the freezer and locked it. And at that point, the killer's friend, who made a point of studying serial killers, believed they had completely covered their tracks. Andrew Herman, the man who supposedly worshipped Jeffrey Dahmer, oversaw the disposal of Shannon's body and her belongings, and his friend, Anthony Gonzalez, who also went by his hip-hop name Tony G, murdered Shannon. But it would turn out, Anthony Gonzalez and Tony G, those two names were both aliases. Anthony Tony G was actually Shannon's boyfriend, Arturo Novoa. On the night that he and Shannon had fought and he stormed out, Arturo did not leave for good. Instead, he came back, grabbed a hammer, and killed Shannon. But Arturo had not thought the murder through, so after it was done, he called his other girlfriend, the woman who Shannon had seen him hanging around with at the nightclub, for help. This girlfriend, who knew Arturo by his alias Anthony Gonzalez, was very devoted to him and was willing to do whatever it took to protect him. which is why she was willing to help dispose of Shannon's body. Police had considered Arturo a suspect, and when they interviewed him after the missing persons report was filed, Arturo worried they would start closing in. So he had taken the freezer with Shannon's body in it to the house of a married couple he knew. He told them he had no electricity at his place and asked them to store the freezer so the meat wouldn't go bad, and they agreed. After the discovery of Shannon's body in their basement, police had begun to look for Anthony Gonzalez, which the married couple believed was their friend's real name who owned the freezer. But it was when the couple showed the police a picture of Anthony that the police knew they were onto something, because they could tell the photo was not of Anthony, the photo was of Arturo. And finally, Shannon's ex-boyfriend John, who had his own investigation, helped Detective Lambert solidify his case. When John led Lambert to the remnants of the bonfire and Shannon's friendship bracelet, it allowed Lambert to bring in Andrew for questioning, because that's who John said was burning all the stuff. And Andrew, when he was interviewed, just told Detective Lambert all about the horrors that had taken place from the moment Arturo killed Shannon until the moment the freezer ended up in the married couple's basement. Arturo was ultimately sentenced to 48 years to life in prison. His girlfriend was sentenced to 18 years for her role in the crime, and Andrew was sentenced to 12 years. On a night in 1984, a college freshman listened to the music blaring through a nightclub. A moment later, she grabbed Hurd, Eight's hand and rushed out onto the dance floor. Her first year of college so far had had its ups and downs, but it was nights like these that she'd grown to love, nights when she could stay out as late as she wanted with whoever she wanted. She and Hurd 8 danced for hours and then finally headed outside to his car, exhausted and happy. But this young woman had been having so much fun at the club with the guy she was with that she hadn't noticed somebody else who had been standing in the shadows the whole time watching her dance. And now, that same person was following her. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast. Because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please tell the follow button that you're going to leave your entire fortune to them when you die, but in your will, actually leave it to the share button. Okay, let's get into today's story. On Sunday, May 27th, 1984, 18-year-old Laura Salmon left Hurd Orm at Middle Tennessee State University, got into her beige Oldsmobile, and headed down the main road that cut through the college town of Murfreesboro. About 10 minutes later, Laura parked her car at a movie theater, stepped outside, and then waved to a young man who was waiting for her over at the box office. The young man, whose name was Dan Goodwin, was one of the new friends Laura had made since starting her freshman year of college about 8 months earlier. And this was the first time they'd gone out together, just the two of them. Laura wasn't sure if this was a date or not, but Dan's invitation for dinner and a movie definitely made it seem like it could be. She and Dan said hello, and Dan told her he had not gotten the tickets yet because he didn't know what movie she wanted to see. Laura smiled. A lot of guys she knew would have just picked whatever movie they wanted and not worried about what she wanted at all. The two of them settled on The Natural, a new baseball movie, and they bought some tickets. Dan was a gentleman the whole time, opening doors for Laura, paying for everything, and getting the snacks that she wanted. And when they walked out after the movie ended, Laura was having a good time and was looking forward to dinner. Laura and Dan ate at a restaurant in the same shopping center as the movie theater, and they spent most of the meal getting to know each other better. Laura said college had been a big adjustment from high school, even though she still lived pretty close to her mom. But for the most part, she had enjoyed her newfound freedom. She asked Dan if he had plans for what he wanted to do after college. Laura knew this was still a long way off, but she was already set on her career. She loved performing in plays and she wanted to be an actress. Dan said he wasn't quite sure, but whenever he thought about it, he always came back to law enforcement. He thought maybe he could be a police detective. Laura laughed. She couldn't think of two more opposite careers than theater actor and cop, but despite their different life ambitions, they got along really well and had a great night. After dinner, Dan walked Laura back to her car and they said they'd see each other soon. On the doctor home, Laura kept laughing to herself. After a whole night out with Dan, she still had no idea if what they'd just done was actually a date or not, but she didn't want to worry about it. Dan was nice and they were friends, and that was not always the case with some of the guys she met in class or at frat parties. And she wasn't necessarily looking for something serious. She'd had a long-term boyfriend for most of high school, but college was different. She didn't want to tie herself down. Early on May 30th, 1984, 3 days after Laura had gone to the movies with Dan, she woke up to the loud beep of her alarm clock. She wanted to yell at herself for staying up so late the night before. She'd had a great time dancing at a local club and hanging out with her date, but now she was gonna pay for it. She had an early shift at the supermarket where she worked part-time. Laura barely pulled herself out of bed and then got ready. She put on a pair of blue jeans, a t-shirt, and a black jacket, and then headed out the door for work. The following day, around 5:00 p.m., a farmer in Murfreesboro drove his truck down a road that ran across the acres of property that he owned. He looked out into a large hayfield near a rock quarry and he saw something that immediately annoyed him. Somebody had left a pile of clothes out in the middle of the grass. Finding stuff like this had actually become routine because local college and high school kids had turned this part of the farmer's land into a place to party. Now, at least once a week, he had to go pick up trash and collect empty beer cans. The farmer parked on the side of the road and got out of his truck. He slammed the door behind him and walked through some tall grass towards the clothes on the ground. But as he got closer, he stopped and just began shaking his head. He hoped his eyes were playing tricks on him and he wasn't really seeing what he thought he saw. The farmer took a few steps closer and then ran right back to his truck. He sped down the road to his house and he called 911. About a half an hour later, Detective Bob Asbury and two deputies from the Rutherford County Sheriff's Department pulled up to the hayfield and got out of their cars. The farmer had come back and was waiting for them. The farmer ominously pointed to a spot a few yards out in the high grass. The deputies stayed back to ask him some questions, and Detective Asbury put on his gloves and walked out into the field. And there, lying in the grass, he saw the dead body of a young woman. She was nude except for a bra, and her legs were spread open. A woman's black jacket covered most of her face, and lying on top of the jacket were 2 pairs of blue jeans. Asbury couldn't be sure, but the amount of bugs crawling nearby and the condition of her skin made it look like she'd been out there for a while, maybe overnight. Asbury crouched down next to the young woman's body. He could see deep wounds on the side of her head, the kind that usually indicate blunt force trauma. And the detective saw something clutched in her right hand. It was a pair of women's underwear. That detail, along with how her body was laying and the fact that she was almost naked, made Asbury think that this young woman had very likely been sexually assaulted before someone killed her. Asbury eyed the jacket covering her face, and that didn't seem too strange to him. Sometimes killers covered their victims because they couldn't bear to look at what they'd done. But the detective had no idea why somebody had also laid 2 pairs of jeans on her body. He carefully removed the jeans and then lifted the jacket to get a look at the woman's face. He saw deep bruises that looked similar to the other ones on her head, and it didn't take long for Asbury to find a potential murder weapon. He scanned the grass around the body and he saw a couple of rocks caked with what looked like dried blood. Asbury was confident that one or both of these rocks had been used to beat this young woman to death. The detective stood up and picked up the jeans off the ground 1 pair at a time. The first pair were men's jeans. Based on the length, they appeared to belong to someone who was at least 6 feet tall. The second pair were women's jeans, and they looked like they could be the victims. Asbury reached inside one of the pockets and he pulled out a stud and tid from Middle Tennessee State University. The photo on this, it matched the victim. This young woman was Laura Salmon. Detective Asbury and the deputies worked with a Tennessee State forensics team for hours out in the field. But the only major forensic evidence they found was the blood on the rocks and also the blood spatter on both pairs of jeans. This was 1984, so DNA testing was not used by police yet, but the forensic team would take the jeans and the samples from the rocks to the lab to determine blood type and to see if they had samples from one, or potentially more than one person. That night, when Asbury returned to the station, he found a message waiting for him on his desk. Laura's car had been located at the supermarket where she worked, a few miles away from where her body had been found. It was already getting late, but Asbury had no intention of stopping yet, so he headed across town to the supermarket and found a couple of deputies waiting for him next to a beige Oldsmobile. The detective shined his flashlight into the driver's side window, and immediately something caught his attention. The driver's seat was pushed all the way back, like someone very tall had been driving. Asbury knew Laura was relatively short, and he knew the men's jeans he'd found near her body most likely belonged to someone much taller than her. So Asbury wondered if maybe the killer had sexually assaulted and murdered Laura, left his pants at the scene, and then driven Laura's car back to the supermarket. If that was the case, it indicated that Laura's killer knew her, or at least knew enough about her to know where she worked. The detective and the deputies did a full search of the car, but nothing else really jumped out. So after the search, Asbury headed inside the store and he quickly found a cashier who said she had worked with Laura the previous day. She said that she and Laura had both clocked in at 8:00 a.m. and worked a 5-hour shift. Afterward, they walked outside together, where Laura got in her car and drove off. Asbury asked this cashier if someone had maybe been waiting by Laura's car for her. But the cashier said she didn't see anybody and Laura had not mentioned to her that she was meeting up with anyone. Detective Asbury walked back outside and headed to his car. If he was right, a tall man who knew Laura was the last person to doctor her car, so he needed to speak to somebody who might know who that man was at. The following morning, Detective Asbury met with Laura's mother at her house. Laura's mom had gotten the news about her daughter the night before, and Asbury could tell she hadn't slept since. He didn't want to stay long or push Laura's mother too much, so he offered his condolences and then got right to the point. He said he was looking for a tall man who knew Laura well enough to know where she worked. In his opinion, this guy was probably Laura's close friend or current or past romantic partner. Laura's mom didn't hesitate. She said she knew someone who fit that description perfectly, a 17-year-old named Kyle Gilly who had been Laura's high school boyfriend. That afternoon, still less than 24 hours since Laura's body had been found, Detective Asbury led Kyle and his stepfather into a conference room at the sheriff's station. Since Kyle was a minor, Asbury had made sure he had a guardian with him when he came in for questioning. Asbury noticed right away that Kyle looked to be at least 6 foot 2 inches tall. And he was a big guy too. Filled out, not skinny and gangly like a lot of teenagers. He was also very quiet, but without much prodding. Kyle said he'd heard about Laura's death and he was upset about it. The two of them had been together a long time in high school and they were still close. Asbury asked him what he meant. Were they still a couple? Kyle shook his head. They were friends and they hung out sometimes, but they were not together anymore. The detective quickly followed up and asked if that made Kyle angry, but Kyle said it didn't. He was still in high school and Laura had gone off to college. He understood why after she had graduated she had wanted to break up. Asbury sized Kyle up again. Physically, he was the perfect fit for this. So he asked him if Kyle had ever left a pair of jeans out on that piece of farmland where kids in town went to party. Kyle got a confused look on his face. He knew about the spot on the farm, but he had no idea about any jeans of his that had gone missing out there. Detective Asbury finished by asking Kyle where he had been on May 30th, which, as far as the detective knew, was the last time anyone had seen Laura alive. Kyle said he'd come home after school and he'd stayed there the rest of the day, and his stepfather corroborated that. He said he and Kyle had grilled a bunch of steaks together out on the patio and then had a barbecue with the family. Following his meeting with Kyle, Asbury continued to fixate on the pair of men's jeans he'd found covering Laura's body. He was convinced those jeans were the killer's, so he just had to figure out who they belonged to. So he sent members of his team to meet with some of Laura's family and high school friends, and he drove to Laura's college campus to see if there were any other tall men in her life. Asbury walked up to the dorm room that Laura had shared with 2 other students. He knocked and eventually a young woman answered. He showed her his badge and she let him inside and said that she was one of Laura's roommates. Asbury looked around the room and it looked like a typical dorm room, shared by 3 young teenage girls, and this just made it hit home how tragic this murder really was. Laura was so young. The detective asked the roommate when she'd last seen Laura, and the roommate said it was the night before Laura had gone to work and never came back. That night, Laura had left the dorm to go dancing at a club with a guy she'd met, and before Asbury could even ask, the roommate said she did not know who that guy was. Detective Asbury spent the day talking to more of Laura's friends and classmates, and none of them seemed to know who she'd gone to the club with on that night. But a few of her friends pointed the detective to another young man, Dan Goodwin, who had taken Laura out to a movie and dinner a few days before she had died. Asbury tracked him down on campus, and the young man proved to be completely cooperative. He walked the detective through the entire day. He and Laura had gone out. He said they were friends, and the date was totally casual, nothing romantic or physical at all had happened between them. He also said he had not gone dancing with Laura at the club, and he'd never gone out to that farmland with her. By the time Detective Asbury left the campus, he had two potential suspects he at least knew something about: Dan, the casual date, and Kyle, the high school boyfriend. He also had a third potential suspect who was a total mystery: the guy Laura had gone to the club with. Asbury would follow up on alibis and keep trying to identify the man at the club, but he was already desperate to find some new piece of evidence. The following morning, 3 days after Laura's body was found, Detective Asbury sat at his desk going over Laura's autopsy report. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma, which didn't surprise Asbury at all, but there was something in this report that came as a total shock. There was evidence that Laura had recently had intercourse, but there were no physical signs that usually accompanied cases of sexual assault. This meant there was a strong chance the sex had been consensual and could have happened hours, or even the day before the murder. This was not what Asbury had suspected when he'd first seen Laura's body. Because she was naked from the waist down, her legs were spread, and she had underwear in her hand. So now Asbury wondered if her killer had simply staged the scene to make it look like Laura had been sexually assaulted just to throw off investigators. If that was the case, the men's jeans might not belong to the killer at all. They could have been placed there by somebody else. In fact, if the crime scene had been staged like that, Laura's killer might not even be a man. On June 4th, for days after Laura's body was found, Laura's mother sat in the chapel crying as mourners filed out of Laura's funeral. Dan, the young man who had gone out with Laura just days before she died, walked up to Laura's mom and said how sorry he was and how wonderful a person Laura had been. Laura's mother instinctively pulled Dan in for a hug, and she told him to please help her find who killed her baby. Dan gave her a big hug back and then looked her in the eye and said he would find Laura's killer. Over the next month, Detective Asbury and members of the Tennessee State Police continued to interview Laura's friends and acquaintances, but they weren't getting any closer to identifying her killer. And then, one afternoon, Asbury got a call from police in Nashville, Tennessee, 40 miles away. The Nashville cop said a woman had just accused a man named John Taylor of raping her, and she claimed that John had told her if she resisted, he would do to her what he did to Laura Salmon. Asbury almost couldn't believe it. It was like the huge tip he had been waiting for had just fallen into his lap. Talking to the Nashville officer, Asbury quickly learned that John had a history of violence and he went to Middle Tennessee State University, just like Laura. Asbury hung up and took off for Laura's campus. When he got there, he looked up John's records and began sifting through those, and then he also spoke to some of Laura's friends he'd already met. And it would turn out that Laura and John went to the same fitness center on campus and they'd gone to a bunch of the same fraternity parties. At this point, Asbury didn't waste any time. He and the state police officer drove right to Nashville to interview John, who was still in custody on the rape charge. John insisted that the sex between him and the woman accusing him of rape was consensual, and he claimed he never said a word about Laura. That was a total lie. And like Asbury's other suspects, John said he'd never gone dancing at a club with Laura, and he said he barely even knew who she was about. Asbury left Nashville later that day feeling frustrated. But despite John's claims that he was innocent, the detective thought he made a very strong suspect. However, unless he could find something concrete connecting John or the other young men who were suspects directly to the crime scene on the farmer's land, then he couldn't go after any of them. Over the next several weeks, Detective Asbury continued to work the case every day, but he never felt like he was getting any closer to solving it. Soon months passed without any new evidence coming in, and Asbury had other cases he had to start focusing on. During this time, Laura's mother came to the sheriff's station often, but every time she asked for an update on her daughter's case, she got the same reply. There was no new information at this time. And Laura's mom got that same response for years. She watched as Laura's friends graduated college and went on with their lives. She saw the young men who had been suspects in her daughter's murder grow up and start families of their own. And she saw Detective Asbury retiring Laura's case go completely cold. Fast forward to February of 2000, almost 16 years after Laura's murder. Two detectives with the Rutherford County Sheriff's Department stood over a conference table, staring down at a stack of file folders. These detectives had been assigned to handle cold cases, and their first big case together was Laura Salmon's murder. The lead detective was Lieutenant Bill Sharp, and the detective assisting him was none other than Dan Goodwin, the same young man who had taken Laura out for a movie and dinner shortly before she died, and the same Dan who had promised Laura's mother he would find Laura's killer. Dan, who was now in his 30s, flipped open one of the folders and saw a photo of Laura. Then, he began flipping through pages of notes from the original investigation. And as he did, he felt Lieutenant Sharp standing over him. Sharp leaned down and wrote 3 letters across the top of one of Laura's files, DNA. Dan nodded. Technology had come a long way since Laura's murder, and now DNA testing was commonplace and effective and could potentially solve this case. So the first step the investigators took was to connect with the state crime lab. They arranged for a series of tests to be conducted on the blood samples taken from the rocks found at the murder scene and from the 2 pairs of blue jeans that had been left on Laura's body. All the samples had been well preserved, so the lab felt confident they would find something. However, they informed Dan and Lieutenant Sharp that the lab was pretty backed up and it might take a while to get results. So while they waited, Dan and Lieutenant Sharp began working their way through the files and Ray interviewed everyone they could. They also tracked down Laura's old high school boyfriend, Kyle Gilley, and secured a DNA sample from him, and they did the same with John Taylor, the man who had been accused of rape by that young woman in Nashville. And on a day not long after those samples had been sent to the lab, Lieutenant Sharp approached Dan at the station. Sharp tossed a file folder onto Dan's desk and told him, "Now it's your turn." Dan flipped open the file and saw it was a record of his interview from the original investigation. For a second it threw Dan off. He'd been so caught up in his work that he hadn't thought about himself as being a potential suspect. But he told Sharp that, of course, he would provide a DNA sample. Despite the fact that Dan was a suspect in this case, he was allowed to stay on the investigation because after he had provided his DNA sample, he was cleared of any wrongdoing. He was not Laura's killer. In the spring of 2000, a couple of months into this new investigation, Dan and Sharp sat at the conference table digging through Laura's files like they did almost every day. They had conducted interviews, revisited the crime scene, and they had secured DNA samples. But they were still waiting on DNA test results, and they were starting to feel like the original investigators had felt. There were several solid suspects, but not enough evidence to point to any one of them. But that particular day, something in one of the files jumped out at Sharp for the first time. It was a witness statement from a young woman that seemed to have just gone overlooked during the original investigation, and it was potentially a huge break. Lieutenant Sharp pointed it out to Dan, and Dan just stared in shock. Suddenly, he felt like he was close to solving the murder of his friend and keeping his promise to her mother. Both detectives meticulously went through the other files to see if anyone had ever followed up with this witness, but no one ever had. So Dan and Sharp tracked her down, and even though so much time had passed, this witness said she still remembered the day very clearly, and she stood by her original statement. The detectives knew a single statement from over 15 years earlier would not be enough for the district attorney to take a murder case to trial, but they felt like their investigation finally had a clear direction. Then on May 31st, 2016 years to the day from when Laura's body was found, DNA test results came back from the lab up. Dan and Lieutenant Sharp sat at the table and read the report and both felt completely energized and like they were almost at the end of this investigation. The test results confirmed that the blood on the rocks and on both pairs of jeans was Laura's. But the blood pattern found on the men's jeans could only have occurred if the person wearing them had been on top of Laura when she was struck in the head. So there was now strong evidence that Detective Asbury had been right from the moment he saw Laura's body back in 1984. The men's jeans belonged to the killer. Dan and Sharp kept reading through the results, and as they did, they kept feeling more and more like the witness they had spoken to must have been telling the truth. And then finally, they saw test results that said DNA samples from bodily fluids had been found in the men's jeans, and they had a match for those samples. Dan stepped back from the table and he felt like he wanted to collapse, like a huge burden had finally been lifted after all this time. Laura's murder had just been solved. Based on DNA tests, the witness statement, and evidence collected over 16 years during the investigations, the following is what police believe happened to Laura Salmon on May 30th, 1984. That afternoon, Laura walked out of the supermarket with her co-worker, said goodbye, and then got into her car. As soon as she began driving, she felt like she might fall asleep. She was exhausted from her night out at the club the night before. She drove a few minutes across town and saw her killer waiting for her right outside of the place. Laura parked, got out of the car, and told the killer how exhausted she was. She also said she could only hang out for a little while. The killer said that was totally fine, and they offered to drive since Laura was tired. Laura tossed her car keys to the killer, and then they both climbed into her beige Oldsmobile. The killer immediately had to move the driver's seat way back so they could fit, and then once they were comfortable, they began driving down the main road in town. But a few minutes later, the killer suddenly pulled onto a road that cut through some farmland. Laura asked where they were going, and the killer said it was a surprise. The killer drove a bit longer and then parked the car on the side of the road by a hay field that was near a rock quarry. Laura looked out the window. She knew the spot from some parties. It was a beautiful day, and Laura was still feeling pretty sleepy, so sitting outside in this field seemed like a nice way to spend some time. However, before Laura could get out of the car, the killer snapped at her and started yelling at her about the night before. Laura yelled right back and said the killer was way out of line, and then she told them to just turn the car around and Dr. her door him. But the killer didn't. Instead, they lunged across the front seat, grabbed Laura, and punched her in the face. Laura's eye and her head immediately began throbbing, but she managed to break free from the killer. Then she threw the car door open and began running into the field. The killer rushed out of the car, caught up to Laura, and tackled her to the ground. Laura tried to fight back, but the killer was too strong, and they climbed on top of her and pinned her down. Then the killer reached over, grabbed a rock off the ground, and slammed it into the side of Laura's head multiple times. Blood sprayed from the wounds and Laura stopped moving. But the killer wasn't done. They dropped that rock and picked up a bigger one, and they raised it up and then slammed it down right square in the middle of Laura's face, over and over again. Finally, the killer stopped. They dropped the rock, stood up, and looked down at what they had done. Laura lay there dead in the grass. The killer began to panic, but they quickly came up with a plan. They ripped off Laura's jacket, her shirt, her jeans, and her underwear, and then stuffed her underwear into Laura's right hand. And then they deliberately posed her legs so her legs were spread open. When the killer stepped back and took a look at their work, they saw Laura's eyes were staring up at them. So they grabbed the jacket and covered most of Laura's face with it. The killer was about to head back to the car, but they looked down and noticed Laura's blood on their jeans. So without thinking, they just took off their jeans. They also grabbed Laura's jeans off the ground and they laid both pairs across Laura's body. After that, the killer ran back to Laura's car and drove back to the supermarket where Laura worked. After parking the car, the killer scanned the parking lot. When they saw it was all clear, they hopped out and took off running in their underwear. And when they got home, they found their stepfather waiting for them. Laura's high school boyfriend, Kyle Gilly, was her killer. It turned out Kyle was not okay with their breakup like he had told police. In fact, the idea of Laura seeing anyone other than him filled Kyle with jealousy and rage, so much so that he had begun stalking Laura. And on the night before her murder, he followed her and her date, a man who was never identified, to the club. Kyle hid in the shadows and watched Laura dance all night, and then he followed Laura and her date back to the guy's apartment, and then waited outside while they had consensual sex, and then followed them when Laura's date drove her back to her dorm. The following day, Laura and Kyle had plans to hang out like they still did sometimes. And when Laura handed Kyle her keys, he knew this was his chance to take her out to the middle of nowhere and make her pay for seeing other men. Like a lot of kids in town, Kyle had been to the farmer's land for parties, and he thought it would be a perfect place to confront Laura because nobody else would be around. But as soon as she yelled at him, he couldn't stand it and he punched her. And this was not the first time he had done that. In fact, during the second investigation, Dan and Lieutenant Sharp had discovered Kyle had regularly beaten Laura throughout their high school relationship. This, of course, raised a huge red flag, but it was the overlooked witness statement that enabled them to fully focus their investigation on Kyle. Because back in 1984, a young woman had told police that on the day of Laura's murder, she passed by Kyle driving on the road, and he was driving Laura's beige Oldsmobile, and Laura was not in the car with him. Dan and Lieutenant Sharp never understood why that lead had not been followed up on, and like Island, his stepfather's story about grilling steaks together had just been accepted. But with that witness statement, Dan and Sharp were almost positive Kyle was the killer, and DNA test results soon confirmed that theory. In a moment of desperation, Kyle had staged the murder to look like a sexual assault. He hoped it would lead police to the man Laura had gone to the club with and slept with the night before. But when Kyle saw Aura's blood on his jeans, he panicked and left them behind. Because there was no DNA testing at the time, Kyle would never have imagined that remnants of his own bodily fluids inside those jeans would someday allow police to trace the jeans right back to him. Kyle was ultimately sentenced to life in prison, but with a chance for parole in 2042. Kyle's stepfather, who had covered for him in 1984, was deceased by the time Kyle was arrested. Dan had ultimately kept his promise to Laura's mother. He had found her daughter's killer. Dan also said that if he and Kyle are both still alive in 2042, he will be front and center at Kyle's parole hearing, and he'll do everything he can to make sure Kyle never gets out of prison. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.